Okay, so we are continuing our series on Adam, the Legend of Blue Marvel, the greatest origin story ever told in the history of Marvel Comics, and I don't care what anybody says. If you disagree, you're wrong. So here's the thing. It's a little heavy-handed, but I stand by it. Sorry, not sorry. So here's the thing. What we end up doing here is jumping back to 1962 yet again. And what this does is, again, it kind of picks up here at the Pentagon with a guy named General Mason. And the big question they have here, what they talk about is the aftermath of everything going on with Blue Marvel. And what they come to this realization of is that Blue Marvel is not necessarily dead, right? That he's actually alive. But what Kreutz had really alluded to, and what we can really infer here, and is basically confirmed later on, is that Adam Brashear stepping down as a superhero, the world needed to know, or at least needed to believe, that he was out of the picture. Because remember, when the world first realized, or really the United States first realized, that Adam Brashear was a black guy, that the Blue Marvel was a black guy, that you had this big rift that formed that was rooted in fear and desire based on that, right? On one hand, it was the black community saying, you have to fight on our side. You're one of us, you have to join our cause. On the other side, you had white Americans who were terrified of what he might do if he did do that. And again, where he had reiterated with President Kennedy, like, I am not adherent to any one race, right? If a meteor is coming to crash into Earth, it's not going to crash into Earth and only kill black people. It's going to kill everybody. It's not going to only kill white people. It's going to kill everybody, right? So I am a savior or protector of the world, not any one particular group. That with the world having believed that he was dead and out of the picture, the hope is that while it wouldn't necessarily cure all race relations in the States, it would at the very least quell that issue itself. But the bigger factor here is that even though Blue Marvel had stepped down at the request of the president, the government still didn't trust him. They didn't believe that he would somehow turn against him. Now again, this is all fear. It's all rooted in fear and paranoia. And so what you end up getting is an agent that calls basically Marlene Frazier in. And she's relatively new, right? She's just brand new to this whole thing. And quite literally, he starts talking to her about her personal life, that she was born, or at least she comes from like Mississippi and that kind of a thing. This guy comes from New Orleans, showing a bit of common ground, trying to create some familiarity between each other. But what she does, or at least what he does, is he asks her the question, how do you feel about colors? Now, one of the things that I want to specify here, and one of the things that you notice here, is she doesn't react with some level of disgust, right? Like, my God, like, why would you refer to black individuals that way? Instead, it's, I never really thought about it. I never really gave it a whole lot of thought before. So she's neither for or against black Americans in general. She just more or less kind of seems neutral. And the response of this guy is saying, like, they're different than us, Agent Frazier, right? Their cultures, their value, they're not the same as us. They're a different group of people. Now, historically speaking, that's the justification one group uses to marginalize another, because by creating that differentiation, what it does is it allows you to categorize them, and then you can categorize them based on the differing factors of your culture. And he even goes as far as to say, if I had my preference on this, I wouldn't drag you, I wouldn't expose you to this whole huge thing. But at the end of the day, our personal comforts have to go away. So where she initially perceives this as simply just kind of a general mission, even though she doesn't necessarily know the specifics of it, his response is, we need you to get close to Adam Brashear, right? You probably know him as the Blue Marvel. And when she asks how close, he says, like, do you have a fiance? And she says no, and he's like, good. So ultimately, what we end up finding out is this bit of history here is actually being told to Adam Brashear by his wife. Now, here's one of the things that I also want you to take note of, is that I wouldn't go as far as to say that his wife is like a narcissist, focusing strictly on herself, but in the exchange between the two, she never really looked at the situation as it's unfolding in the present, which is to say all this information being dumped to Adam Brashear from his perspective, right? One of the things you're going to constantly see as a theme when they're talking is, well, how do you think it made me feel? Imagine what I had to go through with all of this. It's never really an instance of, I'm sorry that I did this to you, and I can't imagine what you're going through right now. It's, well, me, right? Like, look at what I'm going through, that kind of a thing. And so in the end, Adam Brashear feels a massive amount of betrayal here, because what this woman had done, right? What Marlene had done, she'd done her job and she did it well. She studied everything that was going on with the black community and even black history itself, right? She studied Booker T. Washington, Richard Wright, Ralph Ellison, Frantz Fanon, I think is how you pronounce his name. Not really familiar with that guy, but like all these different people, right? Studied all these different members of the black community, the history of the black community in the United States, going back to slavery, so on and so forth, like all these things. And that when the agency felt like she was ready, well, then Adam Brashear got a new neighbor and her car broke down in Georgetown, and they kind of bumped into each other and that sort of a thing, literally engineering a meeting point between the two. What's so interesting about this is that Marlene, from her perspective, it's one thing to study racial issues in the United States academically. It's another together to live through it, to actually experience that yourself, right? Anybody can read about racism in the United States, but I would go so far as to say that those individuals who lived through the 1960s have a much stronger grasp of what racism was like in the 60s than anybody who ever came after the 60s and simply just read about it. It doesn't mean that reading about it has no value. It's simply just saying there's a whole different ball game between experiencing something and just reading about something. And so with Marlene, she was reading about the racism that blacks had to endure. She was reading about systemic issues that blacks went through in the 1960s going forward. And so when she and Adam Brashear were together, she didn't fully grasp what it was, or at least what it meant to be a black man living in the 1960s. And so when she takes him to a restaurant, right, this really, really fancy restaurant, there's a sign that says whites only. And it just never really hit her before. She was just kind of like, this actually happens? You know, because for her, she had never actually seen it or never paid attention to it. She was just kind of living out in the world, essentially doing her thing. Now, as time progressed, her assignment was to be close to Adam Brashear, but to always maintain that sort of, I guess, that barrier between the two of them, to never actually fall in love. But as time went on, she did. And the reason why is because with all the things that he had to endure over the course of his life, that he had somehow still managed to find a way to work past all of it, right? To still come out on top. Wouldn't it be very, very easy for a person to succumb to that, to be filled with so much just anger and hatred and vitriol? I mean, Lord knows, I struggle with that on a personal level, if I'm being honest with you guys. But the thing about this is that as the two of them worked together as a couple, she started encountering instances where not only was he experiencing racism, people who were actually goading fights, because in turn it would lead to him being punished, right? Locked up in jail, assaulted by the cops, or simply just a chance for them to gang up and assault him. But she experienced racism through him, that they saw her as a race traitor, right? You're a white woman dating a black man, you've betrayed your own race, which was a very prominent thing for those white individuals who actually allied themselves with black Americans during that point in time, whether it was through romance, friendships, what have you. Not only that, and what's really kind of ironic here, for all this glitz and glamour and all this talk that these guys put on, none of them really knew how close they came to dying. Because at any point in time, Adam Brashear could have killed them all. He could have just executed them right there, thrown them into space, right? Like flown them all to the sun and dropped them off, just left them in the vacuum of space where they would suffocate and die. And so it's a crazy situation when you look at it for what it is. Like, these guys have no clue how close it was they came to dying. But at the end of the day, with all this information being given to Adam Brashear, despite the fact that they shared all this time together, in his mind, it was all based on a lie. Now, let's be honest with ourselves here. This is Adam Brashear being emotional, and rightfully so, right? He's basically being told by the woman he was married to and that he formed a life with, the entire basis behind us meeting was based on a lie, and it was predicated on the idea that the federal government didn't trust you. So even though you accepted the president's orders of stepping down as a superhero against your better judgment, even though you still, went on like a final mission, even after everything you'd done to protect the world, they still didn't trust you, and I was the person assigned to spy on you. That's basically what he's being told. And so sure, there is the whole life they shared together, but the level of betrayal that Adam Brashear is experiencing is something that simply just cannot be ignored. And so ultimately, he leaves her behind. And he even goes so far as to ask her, like, what's your actual name? And she says, my real name is Marlene. And he says, I think I would have really liked her, and basically goes away. Now, at that point, he flies to the moon, literally ends up on the moon itself. Now, the way that Adam Brashear is able to breathe here is this is what's called the blue area of the moon. Now, the blue area of the moon is a section of the moon that was established by the Kree race during the Inhuman Project, when they were basically creating Inhumans on Earth. So it's a section of the moon that has oxygen, so you can walk around freely. And a lot of people have used the blue area of the moon as their base of operation, right? Like the villain Apocalypse did it at one point in time when he fought like the X-Men and X-Factor and the Inhumans over basically Cable when he was a little baby. The X-Men have operated here for a temporary period in time. The Inhumans stayed here for a little while, which made sense because nobody wanted them on Earth because the Inhumans sucked. But the point behind this is that a lot of people have used this as a basis of operations within Marvel Comics. And so Adam Brashear being here is a way for him to quite literally leave the Earth behind. And in doing that, he actually comes to meet with the Watcher, or at least the Watcher comes to meet with him. And the two of them start having a conversation, because what we find out is that in the early days of him being a superhero, he actually ends up meeting with the Watcher, or at least the Watcher encounters him. So jumping back to 1962, when the two of them first encounter each other, it's actually Adam Brashear with the Presidential Medal of Freedom in hand. He's so pissed off, he throws it at the moon and almost cracks the moon in half. right? That's how strong he is in terms of just throwing an object the size of a $50 into the moon. And so as the two of them talk, it's one of those things where Adam Brashear makes this offhanded remark and just being like, dude, I can't believe it, man. Even when I leave the Earth, folks are still white out here. And when the Watcher changes his appearance to like a black man, it actually turns off Adam Brashear. He's like, no, like that does not really make me feel any better. But the two of them starts talking, and what the Watcher really reveals to Adam Brashear here is, on Earth, that's where you've operated. You've been here on this world your entire life, and you've operated as a superhero on this world your entire life. But I promise you, the issues you're going through on your world are not isolated to your world. That the nature of every being that exists out there, their heart is just wicked, it's sick and wicked above all else. And so when Adam's like, what in the world is that supposed to mean? The Watcher says so much about who we are revolves around appearance and pedigree. What group you belong to, who's superior and who's inferior, but in the end, we each go the way of all flesh. We go to dust. And he says, I know of a people called the Kree. They built these ruins on which we stand millennia ago, but it was the same problems. Blue skins versus pink skins, brothers versus brothers. And he says, all fools, all doomed. Do not let that happen to this precious world. So it's more of the Watcher illustrating this idea that it's a result of what it means when you have two sentient beings in the same room, and they both belong to the same race, but one looks different than the other. Now, in the midst of all this, and what's so ironic is that Adam Brashear, in a lot of ways, questions whether or not Connor Sims was right. Is humanity beyond worth saving? Is humanity a lost cause here? Is it worth getting involved or really even trying to save the human race itself? If the human race is just a continued representation of life as we know it across the cosmos, which is just predicated on just intolerance among the various races on any one particular world or among any one particular empire, then maybe being a misanthropic person is the way to go. Humanity as a whole is pointless. They're never a good thing, that kind of thing. And so as a result of that, you end up having like this, of course, well, at least it seems like an earthquake, but the scout that Adam Brashear had previously defeated, of course, that entire space fleet comes to attack the Earth. And that's when the Watcher challenges his convictions. And he says, okay, so let's say that you are right, Adam Brashear. Let's say that Connor Sims was correct. That Connor Sims was a person who looked at the entire racial war that was taking place in the United States at the time and the various just tragedies that have happened over the course of humanity, and it come to the conclusion, they gotta go, right? The human race just sucks, right? Humanity is just a really, really crappy thing that exists out there. If you truly believe that, Adam Brashear, let that alien race attack the Earth and let them obliterate the whole of humanity. Do nothing to save it. Just let them die. If that's really what you believe, let humanity die. And ultimately, the response of Adam Brashear is no, because in his heart of hearts, he doesn't actually believe what he's saying. He's just exceedingly angry. He's just really, really pissed off. And he's like, no, I'm not going to let the entire human race die, because while there are a lot of really, really crappy people out there, there are good people out there. The result of that is you have Adam Brashear, who of course jumps to the rescue and ends up attacking the entirety of this fleet, right? Basically destroys the whole thing. And so that's when you have this conversation, because again, we're kind of back here in the present a little bit, but what you end up having is this conversation between these guys, where in the end, the Watcher says, you can't simply just stay here, right? Like you can't just exist here on the moon. You have to step back into the light. And where Adam Brashear is like, Anti-Man's back, right? Like Anti-Man's here. I want to go back to being a superhero, but in the end, I don't know if I should. The response of the Watcher is, but you have to. And the reason why is because you're the only one who can stop Anti-Man. It'd be different if the Avengers could stop him or something like that. And sure, I guess they could assemble the Infinity Gauntlet, but like no one ever readily does that because the stones want to be together and people get drunk on the power of the gauntlet. Plus, it's kind of overkill for a situation like this, right? I mean, it's literally like finding an ant colony in your backyard and rolling in with like a backhoe, right? I mean, it's like, oh, I mean, I guess you could dig a giant hole in your backyard for an anthill, but why not just use the right tool for the right job? It's a little overkill to break out the Infinity Gauntlet to kill the Anti-Man. But nonetheless, right, of course, Anti-Man ends up returning out in the Sahara Desert. And so with his re-emergence, what Reed Richards also starts to realize is the Anti-Man kind of phasing in and out of the world is actually a symptom of a much larger problem. That what's going on here is that with the Anti-Man showing up on Earth, what he's indirectly doing is creating a bridge between the antimatter universe and the positive matter universe. In effect, the entirety of the Earth will be destroyed by antimatter energy. So it's really kind of Kevin Grevioux just being like, okay, so here's our timetable, and here's our main threat. Now let's go forward with our traditional superhero story. That's really what he's doing here with this whole thing. But where the conversation between Reed and Stark kind of goes from, okay, so antimatter's returned, to how in the hell are we going to defeat this guy, right? There's antimatter storms around the world. People are basically dying. Then there's a tap on the window of the S.H.I.E.L.D. helicarrier where Tony Stark resides, only for him to be met with Adam Brashear, who simply says, Director Stark, I hear you wanted to see me. With that being said, guys, we're going to bring this video to an end. Thank you all for watching, and I will catch you all later. Peace.